So, all right, welcome Against the State. How you doing?
I'm
How
doing
you
great.
doing?
Thank you so much for having me on, Caleb.
Sure. And you're in Canada?
Actually, I'm in the Philippines, but I'm from Canada. I'm Canadian.
Oh, you're in the Philippines. Wow. How did you get to the Philippines?
Yeah, I took a plane. I flew. I was actually in Sao Paulo, Brazil, of all places, and I flew out here.
Are you on vacation?
This was well, actually, my son was born here, so he's technically Filipino, and my
Okay.
fiance lives here. So basically, my family's here.
Oh, okay. That's neat. Very good. Okay. Well, yeah. So, what is it you wanted to talk to me about?
Yeah. So I've been watching your stuff on YouTube, and I was watching the stream, and I think you make some good points.
Thanks.
I agree
Thanks.
that I don't think China is a global threat. I don't think there's any historical evidence. Have they ever really invaded a country? I mean, some territorial disputes or whatever. Whereas you look at
Yeah.
United
Well, they
States,
did invade.
they've attacked.
They did invade Vietnam in
Go ahead.
1978. They did invade Vietnam in 1978, the Kampuchea War. And what that was, Henry Kissinger was playing the communists against each other. After the USA pulled out of Vietnam, Pol Pot, who was getting covertly backed by the United States, attacked Vietnam. And Pol Pot was aligned with the Chinese communists, and Vietnam was aligned with the Soviet communists. And that was a horrendous event, the Kampuchea War of 1978. That's the last war China's been involved in. They haven't done a military operation outside of the country since 1978, right? You know how many overseas military bases China has? One. They have one, and it's in the African country of Djibouti, whereas Russia has about 8, and the United States has at least 900 overseas military bases. Some people say possibly 1,000. So the idea that they're a global threat that we're hearing from the neocons and stuff is just outrageous. But continue. Just wanted to get that in there. Go ahead.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, Vietnam, obviously, you want to talk about Vietnam, the unjust American attacks well, first on southern Vietnam at the behest of the French,
Yep.
back when it was their allies, their later allies, and then they set up the puppet government in in uh, in Saigon, which is now Ho Chi Minh City. I'm actually planning to visit there soon. It's such an interesting culture, and it's a really cheap flight because I'm in the Philippines. So there's no like it's like $100 flight, so there's no point not to.
Okay.
Um,
Cool.
but I do think we have some areas of disagreement. So I'm a big fan of the free market economy. And why do you prefer communism to capitalism? That's what I'd like to know.
Well, communism is the ultimate goal. And it's a world with so much wealth and so much abundance that the need for any state, the need for any government, the need for any social hierarchy can fade away. Right? That's the idea. That's the higher stage of communism. But the road to getting there is called socialism. And that's when we organize the economy. So we don't have people homeless because there are too many houses. We don't have people hungry because there's too much food. And we rationally organize the economy in order for growth to no longer be restrained by the irrationality of the market, because human labor is more productive than it's ever been before. But because of this profit system, that's making us poorer than instead of making us richer. And so we should have a planned economy, control the means of production. I think a market has a role in the planned economy, and we're seeing that in Vietnam. We're seeing that in China. We're seeing that in other socialist countries. I don't think that means we should get rid of the market entirely, but I do think that you have to have, state central planning to make sure that the means of production and the major centers of economic power function in the interests of society overall.
So would it be fair to say that you support market socialism?
Yes, yeah, I do. I think that that the Soviet Union had many great successes, and that in order to just industrialize a country, right, to get over that first hurdle, you might have to have full state ownership. But after that, yeah, I think that we've learned in the 21st century that in order to have things like restaurants and hotels and the things that make life fun, consumer goods, children's toys, clothing, these kind of things, you do need a market incentive for. But the market and profits shouldn't be in control, right? And that you need the guiding hand of a popular working class government. You need state control over the energy sector. You need state control over things like healthcare and the key vital sectors of the economy should be regulated. And those private companies, the state should be able to step in and make sure they work in the interest of the country overall. And the main way they can do that is by controlling the bank, right? The banking system, kind of like Alexander Hamilton called for a great national bank, right? If the government controls the purse strings and you don't have private lenders and you don't have a Federal Reserve, if the government is the one giving loans, they can kind of stimulate the economy. Economic activity would be good for the community, and allow the market to do its work by incentivizing people with loans and other stimulus, et cetera. But ultimately, I just don't think the chaos of the market can be trusted.
I think that that banking reform is actually very important. The role of the Federal Reserve, in my opinion, has been to cartelize the banking system and cartelize the money supply to allow banks to basically create money out of thin air, enriching themselves at the expense of society. So
Yep.
I
Don't disagree. Yeah.
think
Yeah.
there's
I mean, one thing I do disagree.
definitely.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Sorry, no, that was my son was.
Oh, okay.
Just, sorry, continue, please.
Oh, well, one thing that that I do disagree with a lot of libertarians on is they'll say that the Federal Reserve is a national bank. It's not. It's a private bank that the government sets up. It's like a state monopoly, but it's a for-profit institution that's ripping off the American taxpayers. And every dollar that gets printed, we go like $2 into debt. It's one of the biggest rip-off schemes we've ever seen. And it's private bankers that are making private profits and using the government to facilitate it. So I've seen many like libertarian leaflets and things that say it's the fifth plank of the Communist Manifesto or something. And I would say nothing can be further from the truth. A national bank is kind of like what Alexander Hamilton proposed.
Yeah, well, the Marx did call for the nationalization of credit in the Communist Manifesto.
Right.
That was,
and I agree with that, but that's not
right?
what the Federal Reserve is. The Federal Reserve is a private bank. It's private. It's just facilitated by the state. It's a state facilitated private monopoly. Kind of like the MTA here in New York City. The subways are awful in New York City, and a lot of people say that's because of the government, but it's actually a private company. It's the MTA, which is a public beneficent corporation. It's like a state for-profit private company that the government facilitates. And this is a thing that Milton Friedman and his ideas, he brought in a lot of this, right? That by privatizing government services, I mean, you can't have like two private prisons competing with each other. That's not going to work. But you can have a private prison. You just have to hire one private prison, and then the government pays money to this private corporation. It's similar to charter schools, a lot of this. And a lot of these are the kind of reforms that the rise of libertarianism has brought in, where it leads to the kind of crony capitalism that libertarians are against. But, if you take things that are done generally by the state and you have them done by private corporations, one private corporation is going to get the contract. And that leads to a sloppy situation. And that's kind of the reality of Friedmanite economics. I know that's not what some of the more hardcore libertarians want, but that's what Milton Friedman and his policies have largely led to is more crony capitalism, not less.
Yeah, there's definitely a huge problem in the modern economic system, which it's tough to even describe what it is. Is it capitalism? Is it interventionism? It's a mixed economy. There's some elements of social control, some elements of private control. And what you have, and this is a criticism that the left brings up, which I think is very solid, is that you have the socialization of losses and the privatization of profits. You have these state-private cooperation deals, and at the end of the day, the taxpayer, the Joe Public, is left holding the bag.
I agree. Yeah. Yeah. And that, but you can tell if it's capitalism or socialism by why do the major centers of the economy function? Do they function in order to make profits for private owners, or are they forced to cooperate according to a central plan that's good for society? That's the difference. You can have, a heavily government controlled capitalism like they have in Saudi Arabia, or you can have a very market oriented socialism like they have in Vietnam or Nicaragua. It's not a question of government ownership. It's a question of why does the economy function? And is profit in command, or do you have an economy that is working in the interests of society and the public overall, with a popular government controlling the economy to make sure that growth is, unrestrained? I mean, the successes of socialism that we've seen in like Nicaragua, for example, have been their micro entrepreneurship program. It has been their ability to help, the private sector get going, kind of with government oversight. So yeah, that's kind of how I see things. I'm a 21st century socialist.
Yeah, it's interesting where the distinction between socialism begins and capitalism ends. For example, and you probably know a lot more about this than I do, in Yugoslavia, they had their own sort of system, and and it was increasingly market oriented, although still, I would say, communist. And
Yeah.
Ludwig von Mises remarked, or was asked, like, at what point does that become a capitalist economy? He said, when they have a stock market.
Well, I mean, most of the socialist countries in the world today do have stock
So,
markets. Vietnam has a stock market. China has a stock market. But the difference is that when China's stock market crashed in 2015, it dropped 60 points in a day and nothing happened. The society was largely insulated from it. And a week later, the government called up all the firms and it outlawed short selling. And then on top of that, it basically froze the selling of shares by state-owned industries. And within a week, because the Communist Party said so, the stock market was right back up where it used to be. So they have a stock market in China, but that stock market is not subject to the turbulence, the regular market turbulence that you have with the stock market. And on top of that, most of society is insulated from it. The bulk, the overwhelming majority of entities in Chinese society have nothing to do with the stock market.
So, which country in the world today would you say is closest to your political ideal? Yeah.
Well, none, because my ideal, I mean, the world that we are striving for is a world with no scarcity, in which there is so much abundance and so much wealth that there's no need for any coercion, there's no need for any government. People can just kind of do what they feel like doing, from each according to his own ability, to each according to his needs. That's the ideal world. What we see around the world today are countries that have been kept poor by imperialism, by the domination of the kind of crony capitalism of the West, the big banks and corporations. They've been kept poor and they've been kept underdeveloped. They haven't built their own industries. And so in order to break free from the domination of the world globalist financial system, they've had a revolution and they've set up kind of a government that then takes control of their economy. And with that economy, they start building socialism. They start lifting themselves up. And China is a great example of that. Vietnam is a great example of that. The Soviet Union was a great example of that. I think they needed to adjust to more market policies. They weren't able to do so. And so they, after, years of difficulties and successes and victories, they ultimately collapsed. But there's, Cuba, Venezuela, there's many socialist countries in the world. Libya, under the leadership of Gaddafi, they had the highest life expectancy on the African continent. There's many countries around the world that have broken out of the domination of the Western financial system and then built themselves up with a centrally planned economy. But they all still have a long way to go. I mean, none of them are at the level that the West is at, because they're making up for lost time. They've been kept underdeveloped for so long. And then almost immediately as they have the revolution, then the West attacks them and wages war against them and tries to lock them out of the economy with sanctions, et cetera. So, none of these countries are my ideal. And that socialism, it's not like a blueprint. It's not like we sit here and we dream up the perfect society. It's based on real social forces. It's based on what really exists and how you can change it. You don't get a blank piece of paper on the day after the revolution and just write whatever you want on it, right? Cuba had a revolution, but it was still a deeply poor country. Well, what could they do? Well, they built a healthcare system. They eradicated homelessness. They electrified the country. But I mean, they're still a very poor country. They have a long way to go. But compared to the other countries in the region that are still dominated by Western capitalism, they're doing pretty well. And that's kind of what we're seeing today. And eventually, socialism, this system where you have a rationally organized economy, will, dominate all over the whole world. And eventually that system will give rise to so much wealth and abundance that we can have a world without any coercion and total freedom. So that's kind of how I see things. Does that help at all?
Yeah, absolutely. Some socialists, like Richard Wolff, I would say a lot of socialists these days, advocate for direct worker ownership of the means of production. Maybe you do as well. What is your thought on? I'm not.
That's okay. Go ahead.
You do or don't. I don't want to put any words in your mouth. What is your thought on that model of socialism as a means to transition to communism?
Well, I'm not against it, but it's not socialism, right? Because the essence of capitalism is production for profit. And if those profits are shared by all the employees, it's still capitalism, right? And you would still, you'd want machines to eliminate jobs, because then if there's fewer workers, you get a bigger share. A worker cooperative might pollute the environment to make more profits for itself. A worker cooperative, imagine that the military corporations were all worker cooperatives. Then the workers would want to have more wars so they could make more war profits. The problem is production for profit. In a socialist society, worker cooperatives are very successful. Huawei Technologies, that's the biggest telecommunications manufacturer in the world. Huawei Technologies is a cooperative under Chinese law, and Harvard Business Review actually called it the greatest example of profit sharing working. It's a huge corporation, and they're a cooperative, right? And there are many cooperatives in Nicaragua. There are many cooperatives in Venezuela and in Vietnam and in other socialist countries. So I'm not against it. But that's not the essence of what socialism is. And that's where I would disagree with Richard Wolff. Richard Wolff's a friend of mine. I like a lot, and I've learned a lot from him. But he focuses on this workplace democracy stuff, and he's missing the big picture, which is production organized for profit.
He's a great communicator. And I think that a lot of what he focuses on is, instead of, sort of pure theory, he's just trying to get the message to the public, in a way that's relatable, and I don't want to say dumbed down, but maybe dumbed down.
Yeah. I used to be in the office with him when we had a studio in New York City. He was an RT commentator. I'm an RT reporter, and so we hung out many afternoons and talked about all this stuff. And he's been doing things a long time. I really like Richard Wolff. He's a really good guy. And one thing I really like is that he defends, even though it's not his understanding of socialism, he's into the worker cooperative thing. He will defend China. He will defend the Soviet Union. I really appreciate that. I think that's a good thing that he does. He does say that the idea that those societies were just complete failures, that's malarkey. And I think that's a really good thing for him to say. So I like that about him a lot. And, he recommended I read the book Theories of Surplus Value, which is a very, very, it's like the third volume of Capital by Marx. And I really enjoyed that. So I've learned a lot from Richard Wolff. I don't discount his work, but his emphasis on workplace democracy, that's a little bit different than I see things. That's more from like the syndicalist, tradition. I'm from the Marxist-Leninist wing of things. So, yeah.
And you mentioned earlier, in your ideal society, it's a society without coercion. And that really resonated with me. That's my ideal society, is a voluntary society where all interactions, all economic relationships are voluntary, consensual, non-coerced. And I think that is the goal to work towards. And what we have to do is work to eliminate coercion that exists in the world today. The other thing I wanted to say was, you mentioned imperialism. And again, this is one area where, aside from communists, basically nobody's done anything on it. Communists have put forth a whole theory on imperialism. I disagree with it. I have an alternate explanation, but it's such an important phenomenon and one that needs to be studied, and nobody is even studying it. So it's absolutely, it's absolutely extremely important to analyze and to understand. Why do these empires go to war? Because it's not really for their own benefit. Like you look at the Iraq War or the Afghanistan War, where's the benefit to America for spending trillions of dollars? You're occupying these countries. You're making 1 billion people mad at you. Where's the benefit?
I'll tell you where the benefit is. Now, a country, Iraq, that used to export a huge amount of oil has been blown to bits, and every ounce of oil that people used to buy from Iraq, they now have to buy from ExxonMobil, BP, Shell, and Chevron. Yeah, you have to imagine this is like a business. There's a guy who sells tires on one side of the street, and there's a guy who sells tires on the other side of the street. So the one guy goes to the other side of the street and he burns the business down. I mean, that's basically what happened, right? Iraq was an independent country that was a competitor with big oil, and now it's been leveled, and now everyone has to buy from the tire store that's still open. That's what imperialism is. It's about dominating the markets and getting rid of competition. That's why they hate Huawei Technologies in China. That's why they hate Russia, because Putin fixed their economy by selling oil and gas on the international markets. They just don't want competition. It's about dominating the market and clearing the market and destroying and beating down any competitor.
Yeah, and that's such a tremendous cost to human life. I mean, between the sanctions, both Gulf wars, Saddam Hussein was a bad guy. Don't get me wrong. What he did with the Kurds, horrible. But I mean, we're talking about millions of people that died either in the conflict or, as a result of malnourishment, or they blew up the hospitals and then you died from an infection because there was no. I mean, Iraq used to be one of the more developed countries in the Middle East. And
right. I mean, they didn't blow up Iraq because of the bad things Saddam did. They blew up Iraq because of the good things he did, because he built Iraq with socialism. He took that oil and he made it, the Iraqi State National Oil Company, and he used that oil money to build schools and build hospitals and electrify the place. And they couldn't have that. And he also sent money to the Palestinians to fight against Israel. They couldn't have it. And so they blew Iraq to bits. First, they played Iraq and Iran against each other. Those are two, revolutionary governments. One's a Shia Muslim government. One was a Ba'athist Arab socialist government. They played them against each other. And the USA was funding both sides in that war. And at least 1 million people died. And then the USA put sanctions on Iraq, in the 90s, and starved millions of people and prevented them from getting food and medicine. And then they went in there and blew the country to bits. And yeah, it has a huge cost in terms of human life, but it means huge profits for the big oil companies and banks and monopolies that dominate the world. The only way they can stay at the top of the world is to beat down and destroy any competitor that might emerge. And that's why they hate the BRICS. That's why they hate China. That's why they hate Russia. That's why they hate Venezuela. That's why these countries tend to be oil-based countries, countries, because oil is the most important commodity in the world economy. Like anything you buy is oil. Plastic is oil. You get on a car, that's oil. You get on an airplane, that's oil. Oil is a vital commodity, and they control it. The big banks on Wall Street, BP, Shell Oil, Chevron, ExxonMobil, those are oil banks. BP is basically HSBC Bank. Chase Bank, that's ExxonMobil. It's JP Morgan Chase, and it's basically the Rockefellers and ExxonMobil. And they want to control the world, and they don't want any competition, and they want all the profits to flow into their hands. That's what it's about. Imperialism is economic in its root, and yeah, they want to reduce the population, and they have no problem spending our tax money to do it. They have no problem destroying people's lives. They want to stay at the top of the pyramid at all costs and rake in profits from all over the world.
We can even go back a little bit earlier, 1953, with Mossadegh being elected in Iran, and he wanted to nationalize the oil supply. And what did they do? Kermit Roosevelt, with the CIA and with the assistance of the British, they paid crowds to protest in Iran, and they basically overthrew him and reinstated the Shah. I mean, the Shah was always around, but he was sort of in a power struggle with Mossadegh, and they basically installed the Shah. He had some real human rights abuses, and as a result, this led to the Khomeini Revolution and the present situation today. And I don't know if you watch the GOP debates at all, but
I saw some of them.
Yeah. They were basically all saying, let's bomb Iran, let's bomb Iran. And it was just disgusting to me. Luckily, none of them have a chance, as far as I can tell, of becoming president. But if they did, that would be a frightening thing. I mean,
absolutely. Well, listen, it's been fun. I think you and I agree on a lot more than we realize. And I'm really glad you came on. Thanks for coming on and giving me your thoughts on things. Best to your family in the Philippines. And, I'll open it up again sometime and have you on again. So thanks for coming on.
Thank you so much for having me, Kel. I've had a great chat.
Yep. Thanks. That was fun. That was great.